Welcome to the Modern Mystic podcast, where we help you make your spirituality an actuality and find more meaning, mindfulness, and magic in your day-to-day life. I am your host, Kilkenny, who is an elite coach, yoga and meditation professor, priestess, psychic medium, and astrologer, and have been training and spiritually mentoring thousands of people for over the last 20 years. And today I am so deeply honored and excited to have the unparalleled Vicki Noble here because if you are a spiritual seeker, healer, yogi, mystic in the Western world, you most likely have been impacted by Vicki, whether you know it or not, because she is one of the OG world-renowned authors and activists in the 1970s who really helped midwife modern spirituality, shamanism, feminism, and multiculturalism as we know it today. And we are going to take a deep dive into how to find and reclaim the sacred feminine within and without. So without further ado, welcome, Vicki.
Thank you. That's beautiful.
Well,
Okay.
I can't wait to hear your answer to the first question I ask all my guests, which is, what does it mean, Vicki, to you to be a modern mystic?
Well, I really thought about this a lot. I went back to the 70s when I awakened in 1970 to feminism, to women's liberation. I lived in Colorado Springs, and as the movement was unfolding in the U.S., I got very involved in women's health and the reproductive rights movement. And so in the early part of that decade in Colorado Springs, that was my main work. And we even opened a feminist GYN clinic before I left. But in 1976, my partner, Karen Vogel, and I moved to Berkeley with my two daughters. And I was healing myself from some chronic problems, health problems. And to my surprise, I started to have the most amazing dreams and visions. I've never experienced anything like that before. And that stimulation led me to study yoga and shamanism and just to open into psychic healing and hands-on healing and learning so much in the healing arts, but also awakening to the goddess in a very profound way, all of which eventually led to the making of the Motherpeace cards with my partner, Karen. I later wrote about a lot of these experiences, the dreams and the visions and the synchronicities in my 1991 book, Shakti Woman, Feeling Our Fire, Healing Our World. But my whole adult life has been dedicated now to the path of the goddess and the use of healing techniques, especially aimed at freeing women from patriarchy. My scholarly research has confirmed that inner knowing that I had, that we once lived in peace and harmony on this planet. And so theoretically, we could do that again. My oracles and my mystical practices, however, have kept me sane in the face of the incredible ignorance and destructive energies and obstacles that we face. And really, really for my whole lifetime, but I've watched it get gradually worse and worse and worse for everyone. And I'm amazed how we find our resilience and our spiritual ways of staying present to the dangers, the threats.
So profound, and so many themes that we're going to dive into that you just referenced. So I can't wait. all the things you just mentioned. However, I want to really honor and articulate how you came, it sounds like, to your work in this world that's so powerful through actually looking for healing, which I think that happens for so many people, you know, whether it's a dark night of the soul, but for a lot of people, there's physical components to that, or the physical components and ailments lead to that darker night of the soul. And then we become ripe for the spiritual journey. So thank you for sharing that. Amazing.
Well, it was, you know, I grew up in Iowa, and believe me, I didn't have any access to any psychic knowledge or any of that in my background. So it came out of nowhere. And I think partly because Karen and I were such a good support system to one another, that it was not dark. It was a very light moment, and nothing was scary about it. It was thrilling. And I've always felt really blessed by that, because I know sometimes spiritual emergence can feel like a spiritual emergency to people. And that really wasn't true for me. It was ecstatic. I was
Yeah.
ecstatic.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. Amazing. Well, I want to start really our foray into this conversation with the masterpiece that you alluded to, that you've created, that you've birthed, and that's your internationally famous work that is truly a canon, truly a
Hmm.
masterpiece that really was such an outlier thing when you created them. But
Yes.
these cards, I'm going to go into it a little more fully, and then I'll let you, of course, shower it with brilliance. But you literally have created one of the most famous tarot decks in the world. And before anyone listening hears the word, oh, tarot cards, and hits the pause button because they think it's, too woo woo, or don't love that topic, just wait. Keep listening, because your tarot cards are truly an anthropological and sociological canon of female and goddess cultures throughout the world. I have learned an inordinate amount of wisdom and so much from those cards that I've been working with for decades
Uh,
now. So, can you talk about these cards and your fascinating journey, which you already mentioned and alluded to, and how you then decided to birth them into this world, the Motherpeace?
well, you've said it so well. The cards, the deck of cards, are really a vehicle for all the different things that we were studying, but also all the different ways that the universe was just presenting us with knowledge and material that we had never experienced before. And it somehow, very magically and synchronistically, this deck of cards. Neither of us identified as artists in those days. We
Oh,
thought we were
wow.
going to write a big important book, and actually at that time in 1978, I think Merlin Stone's book When God Was a Woman came out, and Karen and I were deep in our research by that time. We were researching the ancient cultures of the goddess, and it was so exciting. We actually considered making a timeline around our room, so that we could follow all the tracks, and really, we were intuiting so much. But when I look back at my book, the Motherpeace book, which came out in '83, it was intuitive. I couldn't have documented some of the things that I was saying, but I could now.
Yeah.
And
So
so that's advice to women out there. Your intuition is true. It works.
interesting. And so what
Yeah.
I'm hearing about your process of making this masterpiece, because the cards and then the accompanying handbook with the cards that helps you work with the cards and understand the cards, and then your ensuing books, it sounds like you're saying you really downloaded them first from a place of intuition, and then
Yes.
later discovered and solidified them intellectually and academically, because your work is so academic, it is so intellectual. It's
Well,
part of why I
yeah.
love you, is because you really do that very unusual dance and weaving and commingling of the extreme intellectualism with the unbelievably profound spirituality. And that's one of the things I think that makes you and your work so unique. So is that
Thank you. That's
the
so beautifully said. Thank you.
and is that the order then? It was like you intuited? Because when
Well,
I look at that work, I kind of picture like, oh, like she must have gone to the library for like 5 years
we
straight.
did.
And
We
then,
did.
okay, so yeah, talk
Yeah.
us through that.
Well, it was all happening at once. I mean, honestly. And Karen and I were lucky. We lived in Berkeley, it's a mecca. So we went to used bookstores, and books fell off the shelf, whatever we needed next. And we drove over to Palo Alto and went to the art library at Stanford, and we used the Berkeley libraries in Berkeley. It was thrilling. We went in the stacks. We found things we couldn't have imagined looking for. And all of that was happening every time we had a dream or an intuition about something, then we would corroborate it as much as was possible at that time. This is all before carbon 14 dating, and it's before Maria Gimbutas was known to us. And, we were on our own, and we were just in a state of delight, and we're very scholarly, the two of us, but not really academic. The academic scene, I got my BA during the time that I knew Karen, and I was so glad to finish the BA and be done with it. I had no interest in grad school. I just wanted to learn what I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to learn. And so it was as if we'd been set free to do
Mm.
that. And then we were so lucky to be in a place where there was every resource available. And so we were just in a bliss state. And by the time the psychic classes we were taking and the psychic experiences, the Kundalini experiences and things like that, wild experiences were happening. And then we would take classes and try to learn what it was that was happening to us. But it was all really happening and unfolding at once. And then the research, then we would have a dream, then we would, they would go back and forth and feed each other. And then someone came over, a friend, and brought a tarot deck. And I'd never seen a tarot deck before. It was the Way to Write book. Is that how? That's not quite right. I haven't looked at it for a long time, but it was the sort of classic,
Yeah.
Western version.
Rider
And
weight, I think it is. Yeah.
Rider Waite, thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
And so it had pictures, and that was helpful. The older decks, the more classic decks, were just mostly symbols with a few pictures. But the Rider Waite deck, they actually added pictures on every card, and that was really useful for learning without having to study a whole tradition.
Yeah.
And so we started playing with cards. I mean, hours a day, and everything was unfolding. And I thought the female imagery in the cards was definitely goddess imagery. The empress, the high priestess, the star. There are certain ones. Anyway, we got excited. We used it in our everyday life constantly, and then my children, my two daughters, got invited to go live with their dad for a year. And I went to the flea market and found a deck of cards for them. And it was missing two of the cards, two of the images. But in those days, all the tarot decks had two blanks, so that in case you lost a card, you could replace it. So I took it on myself to draw the pictures on the blank card. And the first one I just copied. But the second one was the Page of Swords, and I decided to make it a girl. So I made a little Amazon girl as the Page of Swords. And that was the beginning. Once my girls left for that year, 1978 in the fall into 19, I drew an image right away. I thought, well, what would it be like if I made a deck? And I drew the Six of Wands. And then Karen said, oh, I want to do that too. And she drew the Chariot. And they were just, it was perfect, so we just embarked on it very spontaneously. We literally split the deck in half and chose the suits that we felt the most kinship with, and those are the ones that we drew. And our closest friends and family still are not able to tell for sure which one of us drew which card.
Wow.
And this is
What
without
what
having
a
any.
what a scintillating story for those listeners, because there's people who won't know the deck or be familiar with it, but we'll talk a little bit about it more too, because there's so many topics I want to get into. But they're circular, so that's
Yes,
still so rare, and you were the OG, I
here
think,
we
with
go.
that. And I have them right here for the people watching YouTube. We're on YouTube, right? I carry them everywhere, right? These
All
circular.
right.
And so that's very feminine. And the cool thing is you can, when you get them, it's not just upside down or right side up, but there's the
Right.
whole continuum and gamut of possibilities. if they are slightly right, if they're slightly left, and you detail what that means and what you can contemplate in the way of archetype and message in your handbook that goes with them. Alice Walker said about your cards, Alice Walker, the brilliant author of The Color Purple, said the Motherpeace Tarot has been a wise and loving oracle, a clear mirror also that constantly shows the truest face. And so I wanted to ask you and talk about how you recommend playing and utilizing tarot and oracle cards, because like Alice said, they really do act like a mirror for our own unconscious and higher self
Yes.
to reflect back to us, is at least the way I think of them. And so what are other concrete tips and strategies could you give the listeners who maybe are newer to tarot and oracle, and then of course the people who are used to this practice could still benefit from?
I suggest that the first thing you do is just to get to know the cards a little bit yourself without any instruction, without any book, even though there are books and you can learn more of the tradition and so on. If you just start with the pictures, I think I've seen 8-year-old girls do it. You know, they do it really well because they don't know any better. No one has told them they should read a book about it, and they just read the cards as an oracle. And so I always ask my students, you know, to try to put themselves in the space of an 8-year-old girl
Mm,
and do it from that point and not from some idea of the right meaning,
I love
because
that.
really it and then it stimulates your intuition. You kind of turn it on like a faucet. I
Yeah.
think the trick in reading the cards, 2 steps, you know, you pull the card, you look at it, you're getting a tactile image also from it, and you just start describing the action, what's happening in the picture. And once you do that, it is like a faucet. Then something is it's flowing. Your intuition is flowing. And from there you can make the leap that you have to make as a reader when you say, and so in your life, that must mean such and such, you know, and everybody's so scared to do that. If we're in our right minds, then we're not able to do that. But if we allow ourselves to move into that other kind of consciousness, then it flows without effort.
Yes, great, great, powerful strategy. So one, right away look at the visual to recap what Vicki said, and then to talk it through narratively what's happening in the cards, and then you'll make
Yeah.
that bridge to your own life and how it applies to you. Beautiful sharing. Thank you so much. Let's talk about goddess consciousness, its history, and then how we can bring this ancient wisdom and way of living with the sacred feminine activated within us and without us into our modern day life. Because so much of this podcast, as I really try to give people practical things,
Hmm.
1 or 2 things to do, because I'm so interested in embodied spirituality. I think
Yes.
because, as you talked about, the modern day world is just so much, and for most of us, too much.
Yes.
um, until we do, as you mentioned, the spiritual practices that deliver us back to our sanity and make us activists and,
Yeah.
forerunners of hopefully helping a consciousness and this planet to evolve. So when it comes to goddess consciousness, integrating sacred feminine, what are 1 or 2 things that you could offer, please, the listeners to do that more?
Well, one thing that has to happen through some means is we women are socialized to actually not pay attention to our intuition and our knowing, our what we call female ways of knowing. So there are processes for moving into a space where you come back into your center. You find your center, and instead of I work with mandala practices, for example. I started to get Tibetan Buddhist mandala practices when I guess it was in about 1995 that I was given my first dakini practice. And the Dakini is a Tibetan form of a free spirit goddess, you know, like a fairy almost, but a goddess who takes form as human women, and so very gendered kind of icon of female freedom, unlike anything we have in the West. we have the Virgin Mary and so on, but she's not free. She's compassionate and beautiful, but she's missing the lower half of her body, and so we tried we try in whatever way to come back into that embodied experience. So that might be yoga, might be movement, might be body work, uh, might be therapy if it's good enough therapy. And as I say, these mandala practices, it really did it for me. I've been
Can you
doing
describe
practices.
like a little, excuse me for interrupting, but can you describe
Uh-huh.
like a little soundbite from one of
Y-
them that
sure.
maybe the listeners could do and try on?
Well, it would take a while to actually invoke all the directions. I could do that. It would take 10 minutes probably.
Right. Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah. Well, one
So,
thing, interesting thing is like, for example, I have a Celtic Irish background, which you and I discussed pre-roll, and so like in the morning, I wake up and I do a few things, but part of
uh-huh,
my morning ritual, I have 3 kids. My morning ritual, their days, they're, not young kids anymore. So there are days where it's a few hours, and then there are days where it's 5 minutes, in the way of
uh-huh,
just before I brush my teeth, kind of
uh-huh.
situation, and get
Yeah,
throw on my daily clothes. And one of the things I do is after I do a few things in bed, my feet hit the floor, and then I bow to each direction, which is a Celtic thing
beautiful.
and a theme that's threaded through, Native American tradition and many traditions,
Yes.
starting with
And
the East.
right. Most of the goddess women that when we started at least were also interested in paganism and witchcraft
Mm.
and and so the Celtic version of the mandala, we all got used to calling in the 4 directions and the center, the work of Margot Adler, drawing down the moon. So I was already quite engaged with that process for for decades. And then the Tibetan practice came to me. And it was so interesting because the Tibetan practices are quite shamanistic, and you use the voice and you use bells and drums, and it's not quiet, and it's shamanistic. It puts you in your body.
Mm.
So the Dakini practice is you put yourself actually in the center of the mandala, or at least in my teaching, you do. This is not so Tibetan. I'm making a kind of synthesis with the goddess practice and the Tibetan practices, and I've been doing them both my whole adult life. And so with the Dakini practice, you put yourself in the center and you envision invoking the blue Dakini water in the east. So that's very different from the Celtic. And then on your right, in the south, you invoke the yellow Dakim, earth. And then behind, in the west, we invoke the red Dakim, fire. And then on the left, we invoke the green Dakini, air or wind, as the Tibetans say. And then the center Dakini is white, and she's over my head in this mandala practice, which is very much a vibrational practice. So by the time you've invoked the 4 color dakinis, the 4 elements, the 4 directions, the cardinal directions, then you invoke the white dakini over your head. She's like a tent pole. And it's as if then you go in the world with this tent of dakini around you and with you, vibrationally all the time. And every time you do your morning practice, you kind of reinvigorate that vibrational field, and it expands your vibrational field, and it also protects, and it also enlivens and transforms us.
Mm.
So it's magic in the deepest sense. And, the practice that I've made, I mean, the Tibetans are amazing. They practice for an hour and a half at a time in Tibetan, singing with bells and drums. And so I modified it, immeasurably to make it simple and to make it something that busy householder women can bring into their lives, even though they have many, many, many other obligations. You can do a 10-minute practice and then it sets up your day.
See that? The morning, I'm always talking about that, these morning rituals that we
Uh-huh.
do. And I love what you shared so much. That is so fascinating and empowering.
So
And
empowering.
you spoke of like building this energetic, temple, so to speak, around yourself. And it's so fascinating because mine emanates from the Celtic tradition. My
Hmm.
listeners know I actually grew up in a tantric yoga tradition and then learned
Ah,
about the Celtic. So it was like layering on the Celtic for me, where it sounds like, you were layering on
yeah.
the Dakini after some of those
Uh-huh.
earth-based Celtic, right? So almost like the counter complementary.
Uh-huh.
and and yet, like, so when I do my practice in the morning, I bow to the east, and the east is air, and then to the
Yes.
right I bow to the south, and the south is fire. And this is
Uh-huh.
aligned with tantra and Celtic, and that's why I do it, because they're both my lineages. And so it's like, oh, they go together. Where they overlap is so exciting for me.
Uh-huh. It
You
is.
had
Yeah.
you had mentioned, it correlated to different elements, each cardinal direction. And the thing that the listeners can know is, really, in some sense, just by making a practice up that feels true to you, that elicits,
Uh-huh.
oh, the East might be healing for me. The East might be new beginnings for me. Just thinking about each direction by so many traditions has been honored. What do the directions mean to you? And you can study all different perspectives, and then you pick
Yes.
one.
Yes.
And if it's
Yeah.
true for you, then it's empowering, right?
Yes.
So we
And
can. Mhm.
oh, go ahead.
No, please.
Well, the Tibetans would not say this, but I have come to understand that it's an extremely feminist practice, not just because we're invoking female deities, but because we're putting ourselves in the center of our mandala. We're not on the periphery of somebody else's, a husband, a father, a mother, the children. I've
Love that.
always tried to have my students think about their lives in including all of those things that make us whole. So, for instance, you have relationships, that's over here, and you have your children if you want children, and that's over here. But you also have your destiny, and that's right here in front of you. And that we don't often get to until we're about 40, and have grown up the children. And at least in my generation, that was true. Um, I think in your generation, marriage is happening later and children are coming later and so on. So it's not exactly the same, but in some sense, we do the women's role for a while before we kind of wake up and say, but wait, what about me? What am I
Yeah.
here for? Who
Well,
am
and
I?
that's so profound, because regardless of when, in terms of, like you're saying, certain generations have more propensities, but even like with my generation, it was like career, career, career. But that is still not
Uh-huh.
focusing on self, your highest self, or God,
Right.
goddess, spirit, void, whichever tradition and whichever your
Mm-hmm.
semantics are,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what you're talking about is some practice, that key word that you beautifully, poignantly, and profoundly said, of centering
Uh-huh.
yourself and your soul,
Uh-huh.
is how I think about it. And then
Uh-huh.
the career has a place and a seat at the table. Then the mothering has a
Mm-hmm.
seat at the table, or
Yes.
parenting, right? But if we wait, and in my generation, I'm a coach, and so often women in this day and age, we've had so many blessings because of your generation, who
Mm-hmm.
were at the forefront of all these incredible, really spiritual developing practices and ideologies and paradigms that you broke and paved the way for. Now we have all this career choice. We have so much choice. I think women often wait later and later and later, even
To
to,
have the children. Yeah.
and then the connecting to one's soul and oneself gets delayed even longer
Uh-huh.
sometimes.
Could
So
be.
it's
Uh-huh.
there's so many ways, to look at it, and so many different paths people take. I had the amazing Lama Soltream on this podcast. A lot of you heard that episode 48, working with our demons, gender, and fierce feminine, and other Buddhist practices for the modern day. And that was such a feminist conversation. And she has that Dakini lineage as well. And
Well,
when
she is the person from whom I received my first Dakini mandala practices.
I love that. Would you describe the word mandala to the audience? Because not everyone will know that term. So you said like put yourself in the center of a mandala. Can you describe what mandala is, in your understanding and
It's
experience?
yeah, squaring the circle, just like you do in the Celtic. It's squaring the circle. It's calling in the four directions. And the mandala usually has not only the four directions, but the four in between, what we call the cross quarter days in goddess lore. So there are 8 points. And that 8 point calendar, which of course puts you in the center as the ninth point, that calendar, that shape, that formation, it's all over the world. And when I realized that in the 2000s, I started to search for it because I had no idea. It was sort of a synchronicity that happened that led me to understand that. And I realized that the cultures of old Europe 9,000 years ago were using the mandala, we're using the 8 point calendar. The site on the Danube called Lipinski Vir was laid out in the 8 point calendar. So I only knew it, the mandala, before that from India and Tibet. I didn't understand that it was also in my own heritage. And then I began to be more mindful when I went to other countries and into other cultures to do my work and to visit and I took women on trips for a long time to Peru and to Greece and Malta and England and so on. And everywhere the mandala exists. It's
Yeah.
part of indigenous culture all over the world. So then I came to believe, and I think I'm understanding, that it came with us out of Africa. When when everybody, all humans, came out of Africa, 50,000 years ago or whatever, and went all over the planet. And that's our deepest legacy. And that legacy is matriarchal to the core. It honors the mother, it honors the earth goddess, it honors the mother-daughter lineage of inheritance.
Just so fascinating and exciting, and I want to keep going deeper into these things you're mentioning too, and ideas and concepts, because one of the things I think about too with my background, I grew up in a household that was not Christian, that was totally tantric
Mm,
yoga mixed with Kashmir Shivism, and so total yogic. And then as I started to grow up, then started to reclaim and learn about my Celtic roots
uh-huh.
and integrating that. And I have a daughter as one of my kids. And when I started being a mother, and then she started speaking, we started talking about these things because she's totally, totally a little intellectual and really, really fascinated by our heritage. She at first was a little lackluster about the idea of a lack of tradition in our lineage being just from Europe. And then it's something that I started to think about, and we talk about in addition to the Irish, Celtic, which she's really into, the idea of bringing it into our home more because it connects us with that European ancestry, to our ancestors. And
Hmm.
then the research of how really European culture has this irrevocable connection to peaceful regime cultures, and that lives in our
Peaceful.
DNA. That's pre-Anglo-Saxon,
It,
pre-Sumantran, pre the rise of state, which came from, I mean,
it,
you can tell us, Egypt and Mesopotamia. So can you talk about that, those of us who do have European descent, how it's actually in these roots of what you mentioned, peaceful
yes.
matriarchy, and the history of all that, please?
Okay. Well, it's funny, in the 70s and going into the 80s in Berkeley, the AIM movement, the American Indian movement, was quite strong. And they began to tell those of us with European ancestry, they didn't want to really share their practices at that point. And they told us, go back to your own tradition. And my first thought was, oh no, Presbyterian? Oh no, I don't want to do that. And then, of course, I discovered old Europe and the culture. It's not just a culture; it's a civilization. It was a highly evolved civilization, very woman-centered and peaceful. And so the idea, this is what motivated a lot of the women in the goddess movement, not just me and Karen, but lots of women who were getting started in the 70s with this material, realized the great aha, you know, oh, it's war is not the human condition. We haven't always made war. Because that's what the anthropologists were saying. Oh, we've always had war, we'll always have war. There's no way around it. And we were discovering, oh no, that's not true at all.
So tell us
And that
that
there,
story, please. This actual story of her story, of actual humanity story,
well,
because
think of
we're
us
fed this
coming,
patriarchal narrative. So I love it.
yeah,
Yeah, keep tell us, because
yeah.
so many listeners will be like, "What? Like, how is that not true?" So
Well, and they
elucidate.
always talk about debunking it. They always act as if they've now taken care of it, they've debunked it, they've shown that it's just a myth. But that's not true. Even the most recent DNA material, the DNA research that's so active right now, I don't know if your people know that, but it's been like a real breakthrough in the last decade. And it's confirming all the work of Maria Gimbutas, for example. And she's the person, she's a Lithuanian American archaeologist who put the goddess on the map. So even though Karen and I, for instance, were already researching and Merlin Stone was already doing her research, Gimbutas really opened up the field. And because of her enormous expertise, she was just a brilliant archaeologist in a physical scientific sense. And she did her own digs and so on. But she was also a linguist. She could speak and read 18 languages. She read all the material in the original form and not secondary sources. I mean, nobody's doing that in American archaeological disciplines. It just doesn't happen. And also, she was an expert from her teen years. She was an expert from growing up in Lithuania, but in her teen years, she collected folk songs in Lithuania, thousands of folk songs. So she had this elaborate background of mythology and folklore, as well as a scientific. She had a PhD, more than once, I think. A lot of our work was corroborated by Gimbutas. Our intuitions and our understandings became deeply anchored in reality when Gimbutas came on the scene as a goddess scholar. She had been a Bronze Age expert when she came to America from Lithuania, but she became the expert on the goddess civilization. She wrote a book called The Civilization of the Goddess. It was her last work. And so that freed us to do our own work with a little more confidence, I think, and
Yes.
not paying so much attention to all the naysayers because it's an elaborate world history that hasn't been told before. And
Yes.
it
And
starts, her focus was Europe, but it's the history of the world because, as I say, we came out of Africa with this matriarchal cosmology of the
mm-hmm.
Mandela and our evolution as a matriarchal peaceful people. And so the Paleolithic period in Europe has been pretty well explored because it had so much artistic imagery. They thought it was the pinnacle of human achievement, so Europeans, of course, took the credit.
And which years was that? Just to orient people listening. The
The
Paleolithic
Paleolithic,
area. I can't remember.
about 40,000 to 10,000, let's say. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's really not correct, but you,
Ish.
you
It's all
know,
ish.
yeah, yeah. Thank you. And so it was pre-farming, and so hunter-gatherers, they say, but the caves of Europe are filled with the most remarkable goddess imagery. I have to do a throat lozenge.
No problem. Well, it's an amazing thing because I remember the first time I went to Europe, I was around 20, and
Mm,
the unbelievable goddess art and so many relics. And that's when it opened my
yeah,
eyes to, okay, everyone says, like, oh, there's been patriarchy for, the last 10,000 years. That's still something you hear and read about today.
yeah.
And yet that's
It's
not true,
totally
right? Like,
wrong. No,
it's like
right.
5,000 years ish, right?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
5,000 years ago ish. And then pre
Yes.
that, there's now, like you said, with the amazing archaeologists and a lot of findings that show, oh no, patriarchy is 5,000 years ish. But actually,
Oh,
pre
yes.
that, for 5,000 plus all those other years, ostensibly there actually
For
was,
100,000 years, for
right,
200,000 years.
right. And it's so interesting. And there's so many things to say about that. One of the things you had alluded to, agriculture, and
Yes.
I think that's really fascinating because agriculture. My understanding and my readings is that when it first started, we were still straddling this matriarchal system where the land was still honored, the land was still being revered, the land was still being integrated into sacred ritual daily, etc. And then
Yes.
after, what, 1500, 2000 years, you'll tell us, then the raping of the earth started to happen in hand with the patriarchal structure that started to overpower.
Exactly.
Correct?
So, yes, exactly. And the work that we did, the research in the 70s and the 80s was all about that movement to farming. They used to say it was a farming revolution. And then it's clear that actually it was a long, long transition. I mean, there are sites that were doing some form of cultivation in 23,000 BCE. Amazing. And then it more and more it developed, but it was a kind of hybrid thing where there was still some movement. So they were still somewhat nomadic, but they were also learning to cultivate. And when they finally, they being, they call them Natufians, the people who settled in the Middle East, Jordan and Palestine. I won't even get into it, how ancient our tradition is. And they built cities and they did farming and they did domestication of animals. And all of it was peaceful. And all of it was, as you're describing, in relation to nature, in relation to the natural cycle throughout the year, and in relation to the earth herself and what she provided, and always the sense of giving back, always this circular understanding. The calendar, for instance, helps us to understand in the simplest way what Gimbutas called death, birth, and regeneration, or birth, death, and regeneration. That nothing ever ends. The cycles go on and on. And I've heard anthropologists, talk about native people or indigenous people who believe that, oh, if we don't do our ritual to the sun at the winter solstice, the sun won't come back. Well, that's silly. That's in the mind of the beholder. That there's no superstition like that. It's actual. At winter solstice, it is the longest period of darkness, the longest night, and we celebrate the moment when that shifts and the light begins to grow again. And in the summer solstice, it's the farthest expanse of the light and the longest days. And then we celebrate at the solstice the moment that the light begins to decrease. And it's natural, it's a natural rhythm, it's in our body. We know it, it's our birthright. And that's what we came out of Africa with, and that's what went all over the world, and what lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. Well, 50,000 years in Europe, but anyway, a long, long time. What more time than we can conceive of, I think.
Yeah.
And then the cultures, the civilization in Europe, starting in Greece and moving up and settling around the Danube and and spreading out around Central and Northern Europe, that civilization had 4,000 years of continuance. The motifs, the practices, the building, the script, the figurines, the incredible artwork that came from those people. That went on for 4,000 years without really changing that much.
Of the
Each
sacred
culture,
feminine, excuse me, correct?
yeah,
Right.
yeah, the
So
female
just to,
figurines, there were more than 100,000 female figurines and a few male figurines, and so you just really, come on, just let's be with that instead of trying and being so defensive and so anxious about it. It creates so much anxiety in the academy. They really dishonored Maria Gimbutas, and who is now being completely proven correct by the DNA research. So it's great. One of her kind of enemy scholars, actually came on the air when this DNA research emerged in 2015 and said, "Oops, she was right."
did the humble
But
acquiescence.
they still don't include her in the doctrine. They still don't bring her in to the disciplines. And I've heard from students who've tried to get into graduate programs that if you have any tendency in that direction, you can't get in. They don't even
Wow,
want you
still.
in the department, So
Still, and even
it's
in
still,
California, like it's like
yeah,
unbelievable. But that's just how hard patriarchy is fighting for
yes,
its
yeah.
breaths.
Last
With some kind
gasp.
of we could say that, right? And it's so important to distinguish, I think, for the listeners, because I have two boys, and a very, very incredible husband and father and brothers. So I am really blessed with the karma of being around
Uh-huh,
some really incredible male identifying humans.
uh-huh.
Male identifying humans who call themselves feminists, which I want to get to in a second, and male identifying.
Matriarchal men, we say.
Oh, I love
Matriarchal men.
that. That's so great because I love it. Modern mystic. My symbol's but now I can say
Ah,
matriarchal men too. I can.
right,
Thank
right.
you for that. Spread that logo further. And yet, so what I want to say is there is a distinction that I feel like gets very lost, very grayed, very obliterated, frankly, in a lot of conversations that are public, that patriarchy and matriarchy are systems. They are not masculinity and femininity, right?
Right.
Masculinity and femininity are energies that live within every human being. And no matter how they're identifying on the gender spectrum, right? Matriarchy are systems. So I think
Yes.
often people get aggressive or people get defensive. And I
Mm-hmm.
understand why, some males, oh, like patriarchy, you hate patriarchy, and it's like, oh no, I
Uh-huh.
adore the divine masculine. To me,
Mm-hmm.
that's incredible, right? So could you talk about that? Do you agree with that? Could you
Yes,
extrapolate,
absolutely.
please?
The first inkling I had about that was when I discovered Shakti and Shiva in India. And I realized how interesting it is that they still have gender roles in the culture, but they're reversed from our Western gender roles that say the masculine is active and the feminine is receptive. Well, Shakti is incessantly active and creative as an energy, and Shiva is the quiescent lunar energy, the male energy. So clearly, there are polar opposites and dualisms that we deal with all over the world in human life, and yet the names we call them and the attributes that we apply to them are arbitrary. They're not natural. And so women in the women's movement in the 70s, we kind of busted out and said, oh, we don't have to follow these gender stereotypes. We don't have to be like that. We don't have to do whatever it is they want us to do, wear our pink dresses and everything. And we can still be women. And then I realized we have to talk to men about the same thing because men get defensive. They feel attacked. They feel if you attack patriarchy, you're attacking them. But of course, that's not true. Men can also opt out of patriarchy. Women can do it probably more easily. I think it cost us less. We had nothing to lose anyhow. And so that's a motivating force. But men really, they have something to lose, but it's a false kind of entitlement that comes with being male in a patriarchal culture. And so to opt out of that false entitlement requires courage and a sense of self. And so, I think men and women have been working on this ever since the second wave feminist movement began
Yeah.
to express itself.
Yeah.
And we're still working on it. It's really it's a kind of a mess now, I think, with all the rhetoric and
Mm-hmm.
the heavy prohibitions about gender, but we don't have to get into that. But it's a hard time to have nuanced discussions about what that really means. Most indigenous cultures, have some sort of division of labor by male and female, but they don't care if you don't fit and you want to switch sides. It's called, I mean, there were books about it in the 90s, I think, the third gender, and some very good books were written about
Yeah.
indigenous people and how they've honored the spectrum of expression. And I
Yeah.
like that so much.
That's a
I think
beautiful
that's,
term. Yeah, the spectrum of expression. That's
uh-huh,
gorgeous, gorgeous. And yeah, just for those listening, supporting the deepening of the thought processes and the truth of, okay, what is masculinity to me that's personal, right? And
uh-huh,
patriarchy is a system outside of a human.
yes,
Same thing
yes,
with matriarchy and then sacred feminine being personal, right? And matriarchy being a system, which is a
uh-huh.
totally different thing. So
It's
thank
a
you.
system that these days no one really understands very well. They mostly assume that patriarchy is the flip side. I mean, matriarchy is the flip side of patriarchy, and so it's like God in a dress or something. And it's not like that. Matriarchal cultures are very welcoming, and men thrive in matriarchal cultures. And now we know that because now there's enough research and interaction with between scholars and living matriarchal cultures. We were in a double bind back in the 70s because anthropologists insisted that there were no living matriarchies, and therefore you could not say there ever had been. So there we were stuck in that bind. And then it became obvious with the matriarchal studies movement, an international movement of women researching this and getting in contact with living matriarchal cultures who define themselves in their own ways. And so from that study of those cultures, the last 20 years or so, we've been able to determine that matriarchy isn't women dominating. That's the thing. That's why you can't see it. That's why the scholars didn't think it existed, because there are no cultures where women flip the tables on men and oppress them. That's you're never going to find that. But the cultures that are matriarchy are in fact egalitarian,
Mhm.
and that's what matters. That egalitarianism is what creates the possibility of peace and honoring and reciprocity. Matriarchal cultures, just as in many matriarchal indigenous cultures, there's not even a word for rape. They don't
Wow.
even have a word for it. It's so inconceivable.
Mm.
And so, and we have to learn from indigenous people and from matriarchal cultures how to return to a place of equilibrium in our own selves and in our own culture. And Karen and I were very plugged into that. I don't know why for sure, but that's where we went with it. And more than half of the images in the Motherpeace cards are women of color or
I
people
want
of color.
I wanted to acknowledge that because to me, when I was going through them thinking of this interview, I literally like did a survey and I mean, it's obviously they're your cards, but it's quite a bit more than half. And you really were so on the complete forefront and
Yeah,
cutting edge and precipice of multiculturalism in the
yeah,
70s, you know, and it's
yeah.
something that now has come into more and more, thank God and Goddess and all the beings of collective consciousness, but we're, you know, still has a long way to go. And yet in the 70s, you were already doing that. That really stands out. And, you know, in regard to the feminist movement, which, you know, the feminists, quote unquote, that I know who helped really push that important agenda along in the 70s, and the critique of many of them is that they weren't, you know, very focused on multiculturalism, right? So
Well,
that's a
we
big,
weren't,
not
yeah.
you, but I want to honor
No,
you for that.
but in
As a
general, I would,
whole, right, that's
uh-huh.
a big criticism, which I think is a reason why today a lot of female identifying people and male, you know, because men can be feminists and we should talk about that too, but, you know, have issue with that word feminism, which makes me so sad, but I understand it.
Yes,
But it's
yes.
because of historically the feminist movement not being inclusive and not being
And you
multicultural
know,
minded.
when the feminist explosion happened, starting in the 60s, but really exploding in the 70s, and then the goddess movement, you know, when those things were really taking shape, there was so much freedom and openness to say those things. And we were so excited. It was incredibly life changing to think that there had been peace on earth and to understand that that means we can imagine it. We can imagine it because we already lived it. We know it. It's in our DNA. And so, you know, it's not impossible. And that gives us hope, really a deeply grounded kind of hope. So that was really important. But then, you know, a lot of things have gone wrong. I mean, the culture is so dedicated to capitalism and patriarchy that only certain things from that explosion of understanding um, have remained intact in the consciousness of the culture. So women went to work. Okay, well that's great. Women who want to go to work should go to work. But that's a capitalist outcome. That's not feminism. That's just an aspect or an outcome of a certain path inside of feminism. You know, others dropped out of the economy altogether. Women went and built women's land, you know, and did things like that, and made feminism, grounded feminism in daily life with gardens and children and family life and so on. There are so many aspects that are not honored and not and never come into the media. And so those of us who participate in those movements, we've lived inside of a different story now for 40 or 50 years.
Mm.
And sometimes I'm just shocked to realize what mainstream people think, you know, because we really have lived in a different story. And narrative is very important. And what the archaeological departments are trying to do right now, and they do it quite vocally and intentionally, is they're trying to hold on to their narrative, you know. So they're trying to create, one of them actually said this in a book, trying to create a paradigm or a narrative that is as meaningful and compelling as the one that Gimbutas produced, what they call the goddess construct. But it's really just it's a story of world history and Western history in particular, told through a feminist lens. Not that she would have said she was a feminist, but just that her story told the truth about the goddess culture that are so women centered, but so loving of men. You know, so
Yeah, it's
it's
so
just there's a big
fascinating. Can you give like a few key terms? Because we have such limited time to converse for people who are like, okay, you say there were peaceful times. You had mentioned Maria Gimbutas.
uh-huh
Google her work because her work is brilliant and talks and
and
proves
and
all these things.
uh-huh
Who else? What other things should
and
people be
also with
reading
Gim
to hear
with
this?
with Gimbutas, don't believe a word they say in the academy about Gimbutas because they hate her. I
Yeah.
mean, imagine how threatening it is to people in a patriarchal career whose career depends on the work they've done, honoring and glorifying patriarchy and
Yeah.
war and all that. So it's very threatening. It's deeply threatening to the capitalist patriarchal structures. And that's why it's so hard to get the word out. But that doesn't mean that you don't believe it. When you read it and study, you'll believe it. I
Right.
pulled out one book this morning that I thought might be helpful for
Ooh,
people.
I don't know that one. Societies of
This is
Peace.
Societies of Peace. It does matriarchies, past, present, and future. It's edited by Heide Güttner Abendroth. She's German, and she created the first International Congress of Matriarchal Studies in
Mm.
2003 in Luxembourg. And when I went to that conference, it blew my mind because she had gathered together scholars like me, feminist activists, and indigenous matriarchal, self defined matriarchal people who came and spoke to us about their cultures. And we spoke about our research, and it all came together in this wonderful integration, for me at least, and I've been a part of that movement ever since.
And
And that's a
wow.
very good way for people to check in. Something, a piece of that, a part of that is called the maternal gift economy. And that
Colonel.
work has been mainly produced or stimulated by Genevieve Vaughn, Vaughan. So Genevieve and Haida have been kind of the mothers of the current international movement that's been very active for 20 years. We've had lots of conferences and many books have come out of those conferences. So if you go online to the maternal gift economy, you'll find beautiful work.
Fabulous. Thank you for those helpful resources because we need to know, which terms and where to
Yes.
search because they're all, like you said, in crevices and not funded and,
Yeah.
hidden and
Yeah.
whatever. And,
Yeah.
and researching existing patriarchal societies. There's one in China. I think it's pronounced, you would, I'm sure, know, the Musu, right?
Moso, the
Moso,
Moso. They
right?
were the people who came to the conference and spoke. A
Did they?
man from, yeah, and there one was a man from the Moso culture, and he confronted us. He said, you look at our culture, you think we're weird, but when we look at your culture, we think it's weird because we would never, he said, put relationship in the context of an economic exchange. We think it's complete. I can't remember the language he used, but
Yeah.
basically he was saying it's bizarre,
And men
that
are,
we
are,
do
are
that.
respected and revered in that culture in their own way. It's just different because, again, we're talking about a
Yeah,
system. We're not talking
yeah,
about, right?
yeah,
And so, just to bring it back to that, we're talking about a system. And this system believes in egalitarianism, just like
yes,
feminism believes. What does it believe? Men and women should be equal. I mean, to put
yeah,
really pithily, that's what it
yeah.
means. That's why you can be a male, you can be,
Egalitarianism.
right? Don't we want like
Yep.
everyone to have an
Yeah.
equal seat at the table? This is
Yes.
part of the outer, how I think of it, spirituality. And then on the inner spirituality, just to bring it full circle, like you talked about your Mandela practice, we want all parts of us to
Yes.
have an equal seat at the table, the career, the this, the that, and the great highest self. And on the outside, right, we want that too. So
Yes.
thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing that and really for just blazing the way in so many aspects of
Hmm.
the sacred feminine and for really articulating the truth of the way that there was such wisdom and peace in so many areas of the world at one time, and that idea of, because we know that this existed and you can look it up and study it, then we know it's possible. And that's in this
Yeah.
dark time called Kali Yuga in the yoga tradition,
Yes.
this dark period. What
Hmm.
a refreshing thought and remembrance.
Absolutely.
So thank you for
Yeah.
that. And even in the Buddha talked about, so many different traditions talk about self-realization And the first step, how you know it's possible, how you know that state of self-awareness, of listening to your highest self and having that Wi-Fi all the time is how I think of it, in modern terms. The Wi-Fi is always on to God, Goddess, your inner self. That state of self-realization is knowing it's possible. So bringing it to spirituality, that's what they say. The number one way to think about self-realization is to open up to the possibility that's possible. Because if you don't, you can't get realized. And so many traditions speak of that. And so thank you for that thought about peace. It's very, very beautiful and really, I think, soothing for so many of us who feel scared.
Thank you for caring about the wisdom of your elders and what has gone before. One of the things about American culture in particular is that there's a kind of effort in our educational process and our pop culture and our mainstream to really erase our history. Sometimes just 30 years ago, people don't know what happened, let alone 30,000 years ago. So it's wonderful. I appreciate it so much. I'm
Well, and can
thrilled
you
to meet
speak
you.
of that? No, well, it's such an honor and gift to hear your wisdom and your words and to share them with our listeners. Because as we start to wrap up, our culture is so youth fame obsessed, right? And
Yes.
so do you have any, again, practice mindset just to punctuate the conversation? And then maybe I'll ask you to lead like a 1-minute benediction or something. But like,
Okay.
whether it's a mindset thing or a practice of, that's short that we can do to help reset or ignite within us more reverence for our elders. Because like you said,
Well,
it's so deep in
yeah,
us, this culture
it's
of not, and being afraid of getting older and
yes.
fearing that. And I think a lot of times people see elders and feel adverse or repulsed because they fear their own aging
Yes,
because of our
absolutely.
youth obsessed
Yeah.
pathos. So yeah, do you have anything to add to that and share, please?
Well, I think it's an ongoing and sort of constant practice. If you want to be in touch with the actual aging process, it's not easy in our culture. We are throwaways once we're past a certain age. So I'm way in there now. I'm 77. I'm going to be 77 this spring. And it's not easy to aging, but it can be graceful, and it's quite illuminating, and it's got its own process. It wants to slow us down. It wants to draw us back in. It wants uh, when I really confront death because of medical things or whatever, just the way the culture is just so freaked out by the death process, and medicine is so freaked out about keeping everybody alive on pharma and on machines, and oh my God. And I have this really deep sense that, well, first of all, I'm so grateful for my life, and I feel like I did everything I wanted to do. So I have nothing to regret. And I think that helps a lot. So when I urge women to like wake up and speak your truth and don't be, socialized anymore, I really mean it, because I think it leads to being able to be natural in the process of aging. The Buddhists tell us we're going to face old age, sickness, and death. That's it. And then we make our transition. And so at the age of 77, it's on my mind, and I think it ought to be. And rather than doing whatever kind of tricks we try to do to get younger, I think it's super important to relax into the actual process and be with it in an authentic way. And then when I do that, I find that I know that it will be a smooth transition, the final transition of dying, because I know it's the end of one assignment and the beginning of the next one. And I love this assignment. So why would I be afraid to finish it, let it be done, and move gracefully into the next one.
Mm.
And I think that's really radical in our culture. But I know it's really true.
And what are things that you do daily, like either thoughts you think or ways that you mitigate the outer messaging, that other people could try on to help them enjoy the
Well,
assignment? And
I have to talk to myself about it. I have to just constantly because we're just up against it. We're in a culture that is just every minute. I never had TV for 40 years. I threw away the TV when my kids were young teenagers, and I never had TV until the pandemic. And then I got live TV for the first time. And so for the first time in 40 years, I have commercials in between shows, and they're unbelievable. The way that all the drugs are pushed and all the beauty stuff and everything is so pressured. There's so much pressure, and to being a woman, there's so much pressure. So as I say, I've lived in another reality for the last 40
yeah,
years. And
yeah.
it's very helpful because I realize I'm not a movie star. My livelihood doesn't depend on my appearance or it doesn't depend on any of that stuff. So just don't worry about it. Be happy.
Well, and
Happiness radiates.
I love that. Well, and I love what you talked about the TV and it really teaches one and our listeners and all of us, right? We have choices about what we do with our senses. And though we are bombarded and at times it feels like accosted, by billboards or, you have to be in the world, right? And yet that's what so many different traditions, Tibetan Buddhism, yoga, there's so many wisdom traditions that talk
Yes.
about minding our senses. And so you think about, okay, with my eyes, what do I let my eyes see? And for 40 years you made a choice and then now you're making a different choice. But I suspect because you did that practice for 40 whole years, you see those commercials differently. You have a different
Yes.
ability to navigate because you built a
Yes.
muscle of wall and protection from them. And I'm not saying everyone should give up TV for 40 years, but what I'm saying
Right.
is, like I go to the gym, I love the gym, and there's just the TVs like just everywhere, right? And I am constantly thinking
Right.
about
Right.
drishti, which means your gaze, where you put your gaze. And I have a
Yeah.
practice where I will not look at anything unless I'm choosing consciously to look at anything. And when I first started going to the gym, it was a little distracting and hard, and I would catch myself. But I've practiced that, and I'll run
Yes.
into someone, and I watch them. They're just like looking at the TV a lot, which is fine. But I am like, no, no, I go in there like a Jedi. And it's like I
Yeah.
consume news, but only when I want to. And I have
Uh-huh.
trained the algorithms to not give me stuff. So it's like that
Uh-huh.
may not work for a listener, but you think about like, what do you let your ears hear? What do you let
Well,
your
it's like food. What do you eat? Do you
yeah,
eat organic food, natural food? Do you eat toxic food? It's what you take into yourself is
yes,
how you feel, and it's on
yes,
every level. So, I mean, I'm not an absolutist about, I'm not a vegan. I'm just trying to live my life and enjoy food and enjoy entertainment and, be a person.
yeah.
But we have to make choices. I think that's it. You're right.
Well, and I love how you said that about absolutists too. It's like we can think about, okay, is my, gastronomical tendencies, am I eating 70-30, 70 organic and good, 30, and we each have to find what that ratio is to be human and
Yeah.
to be enjoying life and then also minding our senses and how we
Healthy.
feel, right?
Yeah.
And so you could contemplate that. Okay, with my eyes, how much am I letting in?
Mhm.
That's just like, okay, junk food, and then how much, right? And we just recalibrate until
Yep.
we figure out
Yep.
with the senses what works. So such a beautiful
And that's what they
conversation.
say in martial arts, that when in Aikido, I remember them saying, when you fall off the line, you know, don't worry about it. Don't spend time going over and over it in your mind. Just get back on the line and keep going. And I think,
Ooh.
oh, that's so beautiful. That's Tantra. In Tantra, they say, it's impossible to keep your vows. So just keep making vows and do your best.
Talk about an incredible punctuation to the conversation. That's brilliant. Both of those. Just get bongs on the line. It's impossible to keep the vows, right? Because it's just, I love it because it's just modern mystic. We're modern.
Yeah,
We give
yeah,
ourselves grace. We give ourselves space. It's so
yeah,
important, and that's what keeps us coming back to our spiritual practices. If we're too astringent, then eventually, what this, we know
yeah.
what extremism does.
I brought a couple of little prayers to share
Yay!
because you had
Please.
mentioned that might be something you wanted. The first one is the prayer they say that the Dalai Lama does every day when he gets up. And so I'd like to read that. It's very short, and it's so beautiful, really honoring the Buddhist Bodhisattva tradition. May I be a guard for those who need protection, a guide for those on the path, a boat, a raft, a bridge for those who wish to cross the flood. May I be a lamp in the darkness, a resting place for the weary, a healing medicine for all who are sick, a vase of plenty, a tree of miracles, and for the boundless multitudes of living beings, may I bring sustenance and awakening, enduring like the earth and sky, until all beings are free from sorrow and all are awakened. Isn't that beautiful?
Ah, I'm gonna have to extend my morning routine
It's
that
very
is
short.
amazing. I've never heard that. That's
Oh, I
amazing.
keep it. I keep it in my office where I always see it every day.
It's
And then the
really
other piece
beautiful.
I'd like to share, some of your women will know this. It's the traditional charge of the star goddess, and it's what we put as the frontispiece in my book, Motherpeace, the first book I wrote about the Motherpeace card. So this is the goddess speaking. I think I'll put my reading glasses on for this. I, who am the beauty of the green earth and the white moon among the stars and the mysteries of the waters, I call upon your soul to arise and come unto me. For I am the soul of nature that gives life to the universe. From me all things proceed, and unto me they must return. Let my worship be in the heart that rejoices of love and pleasure are my ritual. Let there be beauty and strength, power and compassion, honor and humility, mirth and reverence within you. And you who seek to know me, know that your seeking and yearning will avail you not unless you know the mystery. For if that which you seek you find not within yourself, you will never find it without. For behold, I have been with you from the beginning, and I am that which is attained at the end of desire.
So, in your words, centering. Those were
Uh-huh.
just incredibly centering. Just to read those every morning or read them
Yes.
before bed, people can do that listening. And I feel like just those beautiful word medicine pieces would just, that's
Mm,
enough. That'll do it.
that's
Thank
enough.
you. Thank you so much, Vicki. Where can folks find out about you and your work in this world that's so magnificent and so profound?
Well, my most technological presence is on Instagram. Not very often, but I do post whatever I'm doing on Instagram in the way of online classes and courses and any travel or anything like that.
What's your
And I have
handle?
a Vicki Noble one,
Perfect.
ONE. And then I have a website. I try my best to keep up with it and to keep it current. So it's Vicki Noble. That's easy. And then
Excellent.
Karen keeps up the Motherpeace website. People might be interested to go there and see about the cards. So that's Motherpeace. And those are the most important things. I have a Facebook site. I post when I feel like it. I'm not, you know, I drop off. periodically.
You post when it makes you enjoy the assignment. I love it.
That's right.
Right? If
And
we're
I have a newsletter that I periodically send out to my list. And that's where I really let you know what I'm thinking and what's happening, and link to different podcasts that I'm doing and things like that. So that's my email address is Vicki@VickiNoble.com.
wonderful.
All lowercase, and be sure and spell it right, Vicki.
Okay. So people find Vicki in all the places with all her things. She's such a phenomenal writer. And she is so generously offering my monthly Mystic members a piece of her writing called She Gives the Gift of Her Body, which is an ultra absorbing and inspiring piece. Vicki, thank you
Good.
so much. So if you aren't a member yet, go to modernmystic.love/member and you can get this amazingly eloquent and profound piece from Vicki, in addition to other bonus content and also my video library of over 150 yoga, meditation, mindfulness, psychic hack, energy management videos. modernmystic.love/membership. Also, I more recently created a intuition tool building kit, and that's free. So if you go to modernmystic.love/intuition, Vicki and I talked about building your intuition, and it's such a part of the sacred feminine, as she said. And so you can go there and get that free kit as well. So Vicki, thank you just again for your profound intellectual and spiritual work in this world for over 5 decades? Is that right? It's just incredible. And
thank you.
Potent, and you really have changed the trajectory of modern day spirituality. And so I thank you personally on behalf of the collective. I thank you as well. So namaste and thank you.
Namaste and blessed be.
Blessed be. And here's to living a more meaningful, mindful, and magical life, everyone.